Good afternoon, and welcome to what I know will be a really exciting panel debate. And I don't say that lightly because I am joined with five excellent speakers today, all of which are experts in their field. We're going to be talking about standards and water stewardship. My name is Martin Townsend, and my role really here today is just to kind of set the scene, raise the debate to make sure that that gives the platform for our speakers to really start to get under the skin of this challenging issue, which really is going to become more and more important for us all as in society. So um, let me kind of just start, I suppose, with my first slide, which is really about kind of getting you to think that how do we really need to ensure that we're making change happen? And this is a quote from Mark Carney from the Financial Times. And there are many quotes that I could have put on the screen today, but this one for me was important because it's about how do we set our mind around the challenge of water stewardship. And it is about us as individuals, it's about us as organizations, us as society adapting. And it is those organizations that do think creatively, imaginatively about how we understand and change that will be the organizations in the future that are successful. Mark puts it slightly more bluntly than that, that if you don't change, you will fail and you won't exist as an organization, which I think is a stark reminder that basically this challenge is not just about the environment, this is about society and corporates as well. Next slide, please. And if you want to back that up, and there are, and I imagine for all of you who are listening either live or actually listening to the recording again, there are lots of statistics that are going to be thrown at you during this water week. I want to concentrate on the left-hand side because I think those statistics start to set the scene for me. It's about the frequency of droughts, the frequency in terms of how it's affecting the population. But also, what does that actually mean for the ecosystems that are required to or need the water to actually sort of survive? And if we start to look at the productivity in agriculture, the impact of droughts is becoming more and more significant. The population that are being affected is increasing more and more. So the statistics are telling us an important story here in terms of why collaboration, why we need to really start to work together as an industry to drive change in a way that we have never seen before. And that's the heart of the conversation that our speakers are going to be sort of walking you through over the next few minutes or so. Next slide. And so what I want to try and do in terms of my scene setting is to kind of lay down, I suppose, our hypothesis. When we talk about the need for water stewardship, I think we have three ingredients that are fundamental to drive successful change. That is about understanding purpose, understanding what we need to try and achieve through this process of change. It is founded on the fact that as we drive change, we need to build trust. We need to make sure that we're taking people on this journey of change, one that they understand and is transparent. We need to make sure that actually underlying that is a clear understanding of function. And what I mean by function is about making sure that we are working together as an industry to drive that change. So let me just kind of unpack that a little bit more if I can. Purpose really is about making sure that we are driving change as a purpose-driven organization, making sure that we can really drive societal good, that we are making sure that we are going beyond shareholder value alone, and that we are actually ensuring that we are creating value. So when we start to think about how we drive change around purpose, it is about making sure we actually have value creation within that process. As we think about purpose, it's also about ensuring that we are educating people as well, because this journey of change is very much about making sure that we help people to understand why we need to change. So that education becomes fundamental. In that line of trust, if you could move back one slide, that would be great. That line of trust is about innovation. If we start to think about the technologies we have at the moment, do we need to actually start to innovate quicker to make sure that we're bringing new technologies into the market to help and support change? We need to make sure that we're not just thinking about water efficiency, we're thinking about regenerative behavior. So we need to think about the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And the function line, I think, becomes really important because at the heart of standards is about collaboration. It's about making sure that we understand the business models that we need to have to drive change. And it is about continuous evolution. So my hypothesis of, and you're going to hear more of this as the other speakers unpack their ideas, and as you start to kind of sort of provide your questions, that we need purpose, we need trust, and we need function to drive change. And so as you start to hear the people presenting, make sure that this doesn't just become a monologue. I want you to provide questions in the chat so that we can really help you understand all that we need to do to drive this agenda of change. And if you could put up the last slide, please. For me, and I mentioned quite a lot about statistics, this for me is the killer fact, which I think people often forget. We talk about 2050 quite frequently when we talk about carbon. But if we talk about it from a water perspective, 75% of the world's population will be affected by drought by 2050. For me, that is a compelling statistic, which actually shows that we need to change. We need to do something with greater pace and greater urgency. And actually, we need to do that in a way that brings people together to actually really drive purposeful and impactful change. I'm now going to pass over to Leslie. Leslie is the person at BSI who's been driving this agenda, and I know is going to leave you inspired with all the work that she's been doing, and to leave you with lots of thoughts in terms of the Q&A session, which I know you're going to have lots of questions about. Leslie, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Martin, for the introduction and for outlining the challenge. So this session is about water stewardship and its links to governance. It's a critically important area. And as we can see, water is very much part of the picture in securing a livable future. So we have a stronger imperative now. And as part of that, we really need to think radically into the collaboration that needs to happen between governments, regulators, civil society, INGOs, and the private sector. So it's really important to understand more about regulated governance because voluntary efforts alone cannot deliver progress at speed and scale. So firstly, I'm going to talk today about the role of international standards in the area of water stewardship. Then I'll go into BSI's plan as part of that vision. And finally, I'll outline where this plan can input to wider efforts to scale voluntary efforts into mandatory action. So on this slide here, I'll talk a little bit about the current situation. So BSI commissioned research released in January of this year, and the research has shown that there are still policy and regulatory barriers impeding companies to take water stewardship action. The research identified areas of convergence and fragmentation across standards and the voluntary initiatives landscape. So issues such as alignment, coordination are all inhibiting scale, and there's still a complexity in terms of operational concepts, where and how to act, and a conceptual lack of clarity on key terms. So any perceived fragmentation can be a disincentive to act and can inhibit further scaling beyond the great efforts of those that are already taking place. So next slide. First of all, there are different ways to scale, and there needs to be different levels of partnerships happening to meet the growing requirements of investors, and especially in the face of increased sustainability reporting for large and listed companies, such as CSRD in the EU. So here I'd like to present you with one governance vision. It's based on some research by Thomas Hale with Oxford Net Zero, and it's known as a conveyor belt. It's very much an evolving vision being adapted by BSI based on similar experiences in the net zero space. So very usefully, it sets out a governance system in a visual way where voluntary standards, international standards all have a role to play, working together to bind and scale action. Voluntary standards are very important, but we know that they do not necessarily lead to action and scale at the speed we need. Although voluntary action is critically important in forging the best path of best practice. What we really need, though, is the ability to bind action and scale it in a uniform, coherent way. So that's where the role of international standards come in. And the role of the international standard system is to scale action across sectors, driving a consensus-led vision of what good looks like. And standards often give regulators the confidence they need to move forward. They also have a globally recognized accreditation capability. There are regular review cycles, and the systems support proportionate and adaptive approaches to innovation and regulation. And this quality infrastructure is recognized by the WTO as a means to avoiding technical barriers to trade. Next slide. So cutting to policy, there are many different pathways, but what we see on this slide is 4 different types of regulation. There's so I'll go over these 4 areas and how standards are part of all of them. So there's self-regulation, and that's when companies voluntarily agree to use standards. There's earned regulation, and this is where companies using standards can gain credit from the regulator. They're then trusted to meet their legal obligations. There's co-regulation. So this is where the government sets up top legal requirements and may refer to voluntary standards as a means to comply. And then there's prescriptive regulation, and that's where the government sets up top level and detailed technical requirements in the law. There are many possible outcomes for water stewardship because it's such a big area. As I've described, standards play a role in all these 4 areas and policy scenarios. So self-regulation is already evident, as we can see international organization or standards bodies like Alliance for Water Stewardship being applied and certified. But to get to the more prescriptive regulation like CSRD, there needs to be a universal recognition of water stewardship, and that's still what we need to do. A major contribution is connecting voluntary and to mandatory prescriptive regulation action is coherence across jurisdictions and coherence to bring a more unified approach to managing water as a strategic asset. And there are, of course, huge challenges here and huge implications. So we now are hearing and learning more about the globalization of water security, especially for firms that operate across multiple jurisdictions and rely on trade systems to import their goods to different parts of the world. So some recent research by Chatham House has shown that around 50% of the water used to produce goods imported into the global north comes from countries with significant water scarcity, mainly in the global south. And that's why trade rules are really important considerations here. And standards can support these areas because we can certainly not tell regulators how to regulate, but we can demonstrate what good looks like. Government can be paralyzed in acting with these complex issues. It's not just the complexity, but the fear of creating unintended problems. So this clear demonstration of what good looks like is very important. Next slide, please. So what we want to see, so what I will demonstrate now is our vision for all of this. Here you'll see BSI's plan, and we used our market research and came up with considering the different elements, we developed a plan. And so that's what I'll outline now. So what this plan entails is working on 2 fronts, that's standards and policy. The main deliverable we would be working towards an international standard on corporate water stewardship. And there's many ways of doing this in the standard system. So we're working through that right now. But what the standard would do is provide robust guidance and requirements to support conformity assessment, offering the potential to verify the credibility of claims. And what we want to see from all of this is very similar to all of you. So we want to see a more resilient world, having the world's water used more sustainably, and this includes by the most powerful actors. Our vision is to mainstream credible water stewardship action. We'd aim to maintain high ambition in any standardization effort that's taken forward and make sure that standards are integral to policy and regulation discussions being taken in the wider water community. So a corporate level standard that is linked to the local site-specific standards would enable a link to general performance metrics, interoperability with CSRD, TCFD, etc. Okay, next slide. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about why we think working on a standard in isolation is not the answer. So if we're wanting to scale up resilient watersheds, sustainable water use while balancing the human right to water for the most vulnerable, we need action on all levels. So companies following clear, credible actions, investors who need to know what an appropriate investment looks like, and regulators at all levels should know what practices they should be looking out for. So there's many other actors that benefit from this exercise as well, like cities who need to build more houses to keep pace with a growing population, but can't because of a lack of water, or vulnerable communities who are producing food items shipped to the global north, even though they know their water sources will go dry in a few years. So decision makers at all levels really need to understand the key processes and actions they should look out for, and they need to be supported to understand where and when unconventional water augmentations or unconditional methods at all when they're appropriate, and the sequencing of those actions as well. And there are three benefits for those who we're asking the most of, and that's companies. So streamlined actions can actually support a transition to improve reporting. So complex reporting can actually happen where there isn't a clear definition of what good looks like. First mover companies also want to level the playing field. And then thirdly, companies need to understand the systemic implications of their actions to put impactful solutions in place. So understanding a governance system, whether it exists now or defining how it needs to be in the future, needs to be set out. And the reason for this is so that the landscape of voluntary action and standards can translate into ground rules of the economy. So next slide, which is my summary. So I'd just like to say that voluntary action and international standards can play a critical role by defining a frontier of best practice that all regulators can aim towards. So we hope if this effort is taken forward on international standards, it's a great way to bring your own unique perspective, no matter where you sit. Any person, whether you're with an INGO or a government or a corporate, you can all get involved in this process and with other international standards as well. Thank you. So I will now hand over to Lucy Gerber, who is with Qantas. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for this very insightful bit. Hi, everyone. So my goal today is to provide you with an overview of the corporate water stewardship landscape, the current one, based mostly also on the findings of work that we have conducted with WBCSD, notably with Julian Hill-Arnold, who I know is with us today too. So let me set the stage a little bit. So if we look at climate, if we think of climate, we know that science has historically looked at sustainability through the climate lens, as you can see, and therefore this topic has had more political traction until today. The consequence of it is that it basically is really more mature today and benefits from international scientific agreements. There are some globally agreed targets that came up after the Paris Agreement, and there's also some single frameworks for companies to use. So basically the landscape is more straightforward and maybe clear for companies to use. Water, on the other side, and you can go to the next slide, has not benefited from the same political attention until now, and also comes with other specificities, which I believe you know as much as I do. It is a local topic. It has multiple indicators. It embeds environmental issues, but also social issues. It is more physical maybe than climate. And I could continue, the list could be long, but basically the conclusion of this is that it results in a proliferation of frameworks that can be used, and this with no global consensus of what kind of frameworks should be used, where and when. That begs a very important question, and you can go to the next slide, please, which is for companies to, this results basically in the consequence that the companies are not completely sure today what kind of frameworks or tools they can use to guide the water action, because this, of course, depends on their objectives, depends also on their sectors, their level of expertise, their level of maturity, and they would probably need guidance that. Next slide, please. That's because of all of this, that WBCSD came up with the idea of putting together a user guide or a so-called guidance that would provide an overview of the key frameworks and tools that exist in the industry today, and that can be used by companies no matter where they stand in the water stewardship journey. This tool, and I'm going to talk about it more a bit. Sorry, I'm going to talk about it a bit more later. It's called the Freshwater Accountability Network, and it is. It came up with the idea of it was that it would fulfill two main objectives. One that was that we really wanted to lower the barrier to entry for companies to undertake the water journey. The idea was really to provide a clear path and really provide support to them for choosing what kind of frameworks and tools they should use. And we also really wanted to elevate water in the nature agenda in order to make sure that it is really embedded in the sustainability strategies of companies and in the whole water stewardship journey you want to undertake. So at Quantis, we basically undertook the assessment of the current landscape and checked what kind of guidances and tools and frameworks should be included in the FAN. So I'm going to use the word FAN, which is the short name of the tool, and that's going to be just easier for everyone to understand. Sorry, that's one more acronym. I know it's Wednesday. I guess it's been a long week with a lot of acronyms, but let's go for that one. This document has been based on the framework that you see here on the screen. It's called the ACTD framework. So the Assess, Commit, Transform, and Disclose framework coming from WBCSD, sorry. The idea of it is that we basically listed the most used tools and guidances in the field, and that we basically classify them into those 4 steps so that companies could really look at it through this lens, and really depending again where they stand on the water, you could say, okay, I'm at the committing stage now. So what kind of framework should I use? How and when? We basically selected an amount of a certain amount of frameworks based on the criteria of a few criteria that you can see here. And I think we can go to the next slide so that you can see a bit more detail about it. So you can see here on the right, and I'm not going to go, don't be scared, I'm not going to go into details now. I'm not going to list all of the frameworks and tools that appear in the guidance, but for you to see how this works, you can see here on the right that the frameworks and tools that have been selected really fit into one of the 4 steps that we mentioned before. And also what's really important to note is that this is a snapshot of the V1 of the tool that came out this year, but it is obviously going to evolve depending on the different frameworks that are used and that also come out. Maybe worth mentioning that we really focused on corporate frameworks and tools, and that what Leslie was referring to before as mandatory frameworks or legislative ones are not featured here. They are appearing in the tool, obviously, because they are important to be aware of, but because of their evolving nature, they're not registered as such. So yeah, pretty much that's pretty much it. I would go to my next slide, please, just to summarize a bit where you can find information. So the FAN, so the tool I mentioned, is accessible online. It's an open source and it's free. That was really important to serve the purpose that we wanted it to have. You can see here it's a snapshot, but you can use the QR code on the right or even the link to access it. It has different sections. It contains a business case for water section, which can be useful for companies who really want to build the business case for water, either to their internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, and have the right arguments to talk about it. It has an interesting component, which is called navigation tree, which is a very high level assessment for companies to use to check where they stand basically in their journey and how mature they are and where they should actually find the most useful information in the guidance. And finally, obviously, it has the list of the tools that we saw before, together with some guidance on how to use it, when to use it, what kind of data they need, and the expected output. With this, I'll stop now and I'll give the floor to Christina Malin from Southport.
Thank you, Lucy. And now that we have looked at what is already out there, my role in the next few minutes is trying to map where are we going and how will water stewardship evolve. Going to the next slide. Thank you. So there are several themes to consider when we look at the evolution of corporate water stewardship. One, and we've heard it mentioned a couple of times already today, is the regulations. So two that come to mind are CSRD and CSDDD, but there are also global equivalents. That is something that corporates are navigating at the moment. Next is another big topic for anybody working on water, working on in the business space overall, and civil society, adaptation to climate change. What is the role of water stewardship in that area? But also coming back to the theme of this year's Water Week, Bridging Borders, Water for a Peaceful and Sustainable Future, there's a question of what is a role of a corporate in this space, and especially what do we consider as good, and how we're defining that, knowing that so many things in the water space are changing. Now, if we go into the next slide, I wanted to start with a very quick reminder of what is out there, what are we talking about, and I will look at it from the point of view of disclosure. So that is what companies need to communicate to, for example, different audiences, whether that is the regulatory authority, peers, investors, the financial markets, and so on. So currently we see three examples here: CSRD, which is a mandatory framework; CDP Water, now since this year part of the overall CDP questionnaire; or the TNFD questionnaire. So these are all disclosure frameworks that have different aspects that relate to water and that companies are looking at. And what that means, because of this increase in disclosure, is also an increase of understanding of how water affects owns operations, value chains, and so on. And if we go into the next slide, thank you. I wanted to take a moment and ask us, what do we think is possible? Where should we be heading? And I will do that by reminding us all of the climate space. I'm starting off with saying, yes, climate, or very specifically breaking it even further down, carbon is different to water. There is a difference in scale, in the challenge, and the guidelines. Carbon is global. Water is always local. And carbon, or it's the key challenge of too many emissions, too much. In water, we have too much, too little, too dirty, at the wrong time, in the wrong place. And the guidelines, and here we see a difference in the space as well. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is adopted globally for companies to understand where, for example, their emission hotspots in carbon are. And this is also the guideline that is quoted, for example, by CSRD when it comes to disclosure on climate. Again, a reference from the regulatory space towards an established voluntary framework. In water, at this point in time, a framework with the same level of sophistication is not something we've seen yet. If you've ever had the chance or the pleasure to look at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, these are quite literally hundreds of pages that companies are working through. So what my point here also is that, as we have seen in the climate change, things that we maybe didn't expect to see maybe just 5 years ago, and I'm specifically thinking of all the work that has happened in the carbon scope 3, so the value chain part, for example, is something that we're hoping to see also on the water side. If we're looking into the next slide, please, I'll look at it one more time or maybe taking a moment to actually define or a bit more narrowly outline when I speak about corporate water stewardship, what do I mean? I've used here the 5 outcome areas that the Alliance for Water Stewardship uses. I know we have Scott as the next speaker coming up, so he might speak a bit to that further. But the 5 outcomes areas really are good water governance, sustainable water balance, safe access to wash for all, protection of important water-related areas, and a good water quality status. This is what we want to see happen. And I'll challenge you for 2 seconds. If you think where you are right now in the world or an area you've been to, do they meet these criteria? Are they really at that status? Many areas that I know are not. And in fact, it's actually quite challenging to find a catchment, a basin, an area that currently is at that state, which also shows that there is room for us to move into that direction and figure out how we contribute towards that. Now, if we go into the next slide, I'll briefly speak of one of the disclosure requirements, and then coming back to this kind of question of practicality of what is in the space already and how What does that mean for the corporate space? By an analysis that we have conducted for the Alliance for Water Stewardship earlier this year, where we looked at the entire CSRD universe, which you see on the slide here, and we honed in on just one of them, ESRS E3, Water and Marine Resources. We are very aware that water is also really relevant in other ESRSEs, whether it's biodiversity and ecosystem or pollution, as well as in the social standards, for example, workers in the value chain, on workforce, and so on. However, we started with that one topical standard to create an understanding of where we're at. And if we then look into the next slide, thank you. We see that already, for example, the data that a company is collecting today, for example, for the Alliance for Water Stewardship certification or standard, has an overlap and alignment with many of the data points, for example, required for CSRD, CDP, or TNFD. What you see here in green is high alignment. That means data that has been collected because of the AWS standard can be used directly with no processing for any of these three disclosure mechanisms. Low alignment means that the data point is relevant, however, it needs some processing. For example, this is related to the fact that at the moment, the AWS standard doesn't directly require double materiality. However, of course, it requires the indication of water challenges and indicating how a company contributes to it, right? So these are low alignment indicators. And then there are a few that are not requested by these frameworks. What you see here is that we're already seeing greater understanding of impacts because of the existing landscape in water stewardship. Now, if we go to the next slide, I wanted to also remind us of something, namely that this is a really exciting space to be in. Right now, there are no companies that have submitted their CSRD disclosure. There are none that have officially met the criteria because we are not there yet. First submissions are not yet due. This is year one, and we're all learning. What we, though, will see is that there will be an increasing understanding of challenges in the water space because of the double materiality aspects of CSRD, which also means there will be an increased interest in finding solutions, understanding on how to address them. And that is something that corporate water stewardship and in its evolution can contribute to. Now, I'm coming towards my last slide here, and that is really looking at what do we need and where do we want to be? I really like this picture of saying it takes a village because it brings us back to the kind of local challenges as well that water experiences. Of course, we recognize the international character, as we heard earlier, the contribution of to water challenges in parts of areas because of products made for exports. But what we want to encourage corporates also working in the space is understanding what is your role in this village, what might we expect of you in the future, and how do we together share these challenges that we're facing. And with that, I'm handing over to Scott from the Alliance for Water Stewardship.
Thanks very much, Christina. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. I'm Scott. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at the Alliance for Water Stewardship. For those that don't know, AWS is custodians of a voluntary sustainability standard for water that we've been developing and running for about 10 years. We are also the custodians, we're also the custodians of a membership network of roughly 200 plus organizations, ranging from multinational corporates, development agencies, all the international NGOs focused on water stewardship, consultancies, research agencies, etc. The common denominator amongst our membership is that they tend to operate at the cutting edge of water stewardship. So we have both 10 years plus experience and standards, and we have a network of the organisations who are really at the forefront of what water stewardship could be. So what Lucy and Christina have described is more or less the state of nature as things currently stand. I'm going to talk about what they potentially could be. Some of this is AWS's view, some of it's my own. I'm going to be quite blunt, and I'll refer back to kind of Martin's point earlier on about the need for pace of change. To get straight to it, I have got 4 key points. The first is that the voluntary sector has won the argument that the landscape of what we've produced and we continue to produce is a mess. Regulation presents us with an opportunity to capitalise on our victory by reaching scale. But scale requires a rationalisation and a clearer outline of what good looks like and how to do it. Scale also opens a new window to rethink voluntary systems and to set even higher bar ambitions. So point 1, the freshwater aspects of CSRD ESRS3, they did not magically appear out of nowhere. It's the result of 15 years plus hard work by the water stewardship community. This is a victory. We all should be proud of it and we should all celebrate it. However, the change from voluntary to regulatory also creates a problem for voluntary system, because if companies are now going to focus on CSRD, we all now need to demonstrate that our frameworks, our tools, and all of our proprietary methods are relevant. I know this because I hired Christina about 6 months ago to do exactly that for AWS. I asked her to map how the AWS standard connects to CSRD. I asked her to tell us how we could improve the standard to better link it. Why? Because we want to be relevant. I expect most organisations attending this session have done something similar. I know this because literally every second post I see on LinkedIn is, what does CSRD mean for you? Find out in my webinar. Relevance. Subtext here is relevance. Come to my webinar. I am relevant. So my job involves speaking to companies a lot. I do that pretty much most days. And the same 2 things come up again and again and again. So if it's a company that's already started on water, it is, if 1/10 of the time that I spent on reporting was spent on actually doing, we would have a much better world. If it's a new company that's trying to explore the water stewardship space, it is, which of these things should I choose? Which of these things should I join? What does your thing do that the other organisation's things doesn't do? What do I do about all of this stuff? So the stuff that Lucy talked about with FAN. In preparing its initial report, BSI reviewed 27 different voluntary frameworks on water. 27. That's crazy, and it's confusing and it's problematic. Now, if you put all these things together, what you're likely going to see soon is an avalanche of repurposed voluntary frameworks. New, now with added CSRD. And there'll probably end up being even more new ones. So that 27 will become 37, will become 47. Who knows? The thing that makes me think, and the question back to you is this a waste of energy? Is it a waste of opportunity? And does it really need to be like that? And that brings me back to points 2 and 3. So regulation presents us with an opportunity to capitalise on the victory of CSRD by reaching scale. But scale requires a rationalisation and a clearer outline of what good looks like and how to do it. Now, no disrespect to Lucy and to WBCSD, but FAN should not exist. It should not need to exist. The fact that it does tells you something. It tells you that the landscape of what we've produced is unnavigable. In a logical world, the things that we've made would speak to each other. The diagnostics tools would link to the solutions frameworks. The solutions frameworks would match the disclosure processes. They did in the beginning, 15 plus years ago, but things have gotten off kilter. And now I realise why, because every organisation, every voluntary organisation has its own strategy, has its own board, has its own stakeholders, has funding needs, has businesses it needs to engage. AWS is no different. We are exactly the same. But that lack of alignment creates problems. For companies, it creates a world of uncertain choices. And for some, it also creates an opportunity to low bar, to do what they can get away with. More importantly, it makes it difficult to engage the other sectors that are critical to impact. So we all say at Stockholm every year, we want investors to incentivise good companies over bad. But we don't have any clear message on what actions make one good and another one not. We have no clear direction on what investors should be asking for. We also want the public sector to engage with water stewardship. Again, we have no clear message on what that will involve. We have no clear message on what the public sector could ask local SMEs, for example, to do. CSRD opens up a window to reset. ISO standards aligned to CSRD could better define what good company governance on water involves, what good water management in SMEs and supply chains involves, set international norms, consistency, something that's easily understood by businesses, by investors, and the public sector alike. This is why I'm saying that scale requires rationalization and a clearer outline of what good looks like and how to do it. For AWS, the proposal from BSI is a route to that. Now, I'm going to close with the last point, that regulation creates a new opportunity to set higher bar ambitions. Voluntary and regulatory processes, they sit in a perpetual dynamic, influencing and responding to each other. The voluntary systems of water stewardship raised the bar. That resulted in CSRD ESRS 3. The leadership companies met the bar set by the voluntary systems because they wanted to be seen as leaders. This opened up dialogues that resulted in CSRD freshwater. So in effect, CSRD is the child of voluntary pressure, of leaders going beyond, leading NGOs, leading companies, setting the agenda. Yes, we can and we will adjust all of the tools and the frameworks that we've all built to demonstrate relevance. But that's really just a small part of the opportunity that sits before us. The bigger part of the opportunity, I think, is in raising the bar again. The leading companies will always want to be seen as leaders. They have a dynamic that requires them to stand apart, to stand ahead. They have an innate need to stand out from the crowd. I've seen this consistently across my 8 years with Alliance for Water Stewardship. Voluntary approaches, voluntary systems can help leading companies raise the bar again by going beyond CSRD. Now, I don't really have the answers as to what raising of the bar could be. Personally, I think better defining what good looks like in a company strategy will be one part of it. Another will be defining collective action to better connect with policy in the public sector. That will be another part of it. But that conversation on raising the bar again, that is what voluntary systems should now really focus on, not just here is how my thing now meets CSRD. Thank you very much for listening. I very much welcome your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's quite a challenge really to go after that very clear manifesto that you just gave on the situation in the sector and where you see the steps for the future. Hello, everybody. My name is Virginia Newton-Lewis and I'm the Director of Water Sustainability at Grundfos. We are very interested in the standard space and clearly see the potential to raise the bar and drive action on water. My job here is to moderate the end of this session and to take your questions. So I can see some here coming into the chat, which I'm going to portion out to our panelists. But before we get to the questions in the chat, I'd just like to take a moment to summarize some of the arguments that we've heard, and maybe as we have some time, probe a little deeper with our panelists. So we very clearly heard from Scott and the other speakers that we're at a turning point. A pivot point, if you like, going from voluntary action on water stewardship towards a more regulated framework. We have a clear opportunity here to raise the bar, reduce confusion, bring more actors into the area of water stewardship and increase the number of companies who are taking really positive action. We've heard themes from our panelists around the confusing state of the current landscape. We've very much heard the need to drive scale and to increase visibility. So on this question of driving scale, Martin, I would like to turn to you. So Martin, you have spent many years working at the British Standards Institution, working on the role of standards at both a national level and through the international standards system. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit for the audience about how you see the role of standards in driving this question of scale, increasing the number of actors who can then act.
Thank you. Great question to ask. I think this is the heartland of BSI. You know, the issue about working with committees to develop standards with stakeholders to make sure we get the content right, ensuring that we develop that standard in an inclusive way, But then actually it's then about taking it from a national standards body, and Leslie talked about that, to make sure it becomes a truly international kind of document that can be viewed globally. And I think this is where we probably don't sell ourselves as a organization as much as we should do sometimes. Standards are incredibly powerful mechanisms. They're powerful because we can develop them quickly. They're powerful because there is a relationship between regulation and voluntary standards. And they are powerful because, the network of organizations we work with means that we can work with them to adopt quickly as well. And so this issue about scale is about market confidence. It's about making sure that we have a standard where we build trust, but it's also about using the national standards body network through organizations like ISO, where we can actually really scale things up to actually ensure that we get commonality. And if we look at some of the standards that have been out there for many years, they just become part of the lexicon of what people do. So if you look at 14,001, large number of corporates use that standard. It is kind of business as usual. You talk to some of the large procurement specifiers, if you don't have a 14,001, you're not in our supply chain. And I think that's where BSI and our colleagues in other standards bodies can really work to make sure that this process of change is one that is adopted rapidly, is understood, but is done in a way that basically is free of any bias, which is where BSI plays its significant role.
Wonderful. So I heard there this issue of trust, where BSI and other national standards bodies can bring confidence to the market, and this idea of rapidity and scale. And actually, talking about rapidity, there is a question in the chat from Keith Small, who talks about whether or not there is merit in setting a timeline to set global stewardship standards. So Martin, while I've got you on the microphone, I'm going to direct that one at you as well, and then we will move on to the others. So do you think there's merit in time boxing some of these initiatives, or does that kind of create panic, if you like?
I think this is about, and this is something that Scott mentioned, I think he's referring to me when he mentioned it, is that, pace is important here. And one thing I've learned through the standards making process, both at BSI and in previous roles, is that, you need to get out there and you need to put down a marker. And I think there is a need now to make sure that we work quickly. We work with the industry to create the first version of what we've been talking about today, and to bring some certainty, because we can have multiple conversations, but are we going to actually create a better outcome if we spend far too long talking about things? I think now, and I was trying to emphasize this in my introduction, now's the time for action. And actually we can refine and we can change and we can evolve things over time. But I think the most important thing for me now is to make sure that all of what we've heard today comes to life and comes to life quickly. And with all standards, you can evolve them, you can change them. And I'm very much of the view when we talk about water stewardship, we will need to evolve it quickly. We will need to learn. And there's some other great, comments in the chat as well about, and how do we make sure it's relevant for different markets in different parts of the world with different challenges. That's something which, is going to take time, but we need to start now rather than spending too long just talking about it, I suppose.
Great. So we heard there that, standards aren't static. They're not a snapshot in time. They can evolve and we can move them. And you did a great segue into the questions in the chat. So Scott, be ready. Not quite yet, but after Leslie, I'm going to come to you on the question about standards in Africa. So have a think about what you're going to say. Leslie, though, I am going to put you on the spot because one of the questions that we hear often when we talk about this work is, well, you say there's so much fragmentation in the space, so how come you're going to propose another standard? Do you have an answer to that? Is the answer to this confusing landscape yet another standard?
So I think the answer to that is in terms of our process. So really the purpose of this whole exercise is to harmonize. So that's why BSI funded research and a mapping of voluntary initiatives at the start of this process and did market research to see if there's an appetite for another product. So, and the results of that are available on BSI's website. So they're great insights and words of caution as well. And BSI is really taking the advice, talking to markets of the corporates who will be using this standard, hopefully, and also making sure that concerns and huge viable concerns that there are just so many products being developed right now. But I'd also like to draw on the fact that not only is our approach to harmonize, but there won't be any additional burdens on business for this. So this is not another. So this is if an international organization or a corporate chooses to take it up, they can be assured that they're able to make their claims and get their sites certified or whatever approach we take. It's a different system, and it's been around for a long time. So the international standards can be used in different ways by audiences who might not have considered water stewardship previously.
Wonderful. So I think a very clear message there that this is not an initiative to increase fragmentation. It's very much about harmonization and capitalizing on the opportunity that we see now, particularly with the CSRD coming in. Great. Scott, there are two questions here. My suggestion is going to be that we take one on in this discussion and perhaps one you could answer in the chat. So the one I would like to bring into the discussion is this question of how do we approach the design and implementation of standards, bearing in mind the different needs of different markets? And the question here from Abel is about local markets, especially in African countries. I mean, do you have some insight on this topic from your experience with AWS, for example, about the different approaches to different markets?
Yes is the short answer. There is an Africa-shaped hole in the world of water stewardship. It's kind of like, it's as simple as that. Water stewardship as a paradigm is very much based on globalization. It's sort of like, I look at the figures in terms of kind of the membership of AWS, the membership of the Seal Water Mandate, disclosures of CDP, etc., etc. And consistently what we see is that it's a European and North American paradigm. It's driven by company brands really looking at their supply chains. Now, that's not to say it's not globalized. It is globalized. So, for example, the standard has been applied in 60 countries, right? So that's a lot of countries. But it's primarily driven by Europe and North America. Africa, not so much. Why is that? Because not that many companies care about Africa, basically. It's sort of like there just isn't enough companies who see Africa as a priority. And that's why you see an Africa-shaped hole in water stewardship. So what's the answer to that? Well, the answer to that is basically, A, grow the number of people who are doing, well, there's two answers. So grow the number of corporates that are kind of like following regulation, following standards, will increase the number of people acting in supply chains. So that exponentially could increase the number of people caring about Africa, etc., because there's an increased volume of kind of use of standards. Then the other thing is African-centered, African-headquartered, African companies that deal directly in Africa create standards which are applicable, create standards which are accessible, create standards that are usable by SMEs. Now, the AWS standard is the highest bar in standards in water stewardship. That's not going to change. Sort of like our market, our ambition, and our focus is on leadership. So we work with the companies who do the most action. But there is a huge opportunity, particularly around CSRD, to create scale. And scale requires, as we've all talked about, rationalization and accessibility and a clear message on kind of like, what does a company do? What does an investor look for from a company? What does the public sector require of companies? Yeah, does that answer the question?
It does answer the question. So we heard about the Africa-shaped hole in water stewardship, and we heard several suggestions from you about how we could go about filling that, related to accessibility and related to about framing and context of the standards, so making sure it's appropriate. Thank you, Scott. I would also ask you, if you could, to look at the questions from Suri. I'm so sorry, Dr. Suri Lankanovic, and I'm probably pronouncing your second name very terribly, but there's a question here about certifying water resources used by small farmers in developing countries, and also a question from Sarah around certifying voluntary action on the ground through the issuing of AWS standards. So Scott, I might ask if you could type your answers to that while I go to Lucy instead. So Lucy, you showed us very visually there the fragmentation in the water stewardship landscape. How have your stakeholders responded to this, Fan? Have they been surprised? Were you telling them something that they knew already? And have they been able to kind of use the information in the Fan to better support their thinking on water? What's been the reaction to this work?
Thank you for the question, Virginia. Yes, happy to provide a few insights on this. I don't think surprise would be the right word here, because obviously, and we've all touched upon that topic today, and also probably during the week at other sessions. The fragmentation of the field is something that everybody is aware of, and really trying to improve. So I would say probably instead of surprise, I would say probably welcoming would probably be the best word. I think it was the initiative was really welcomed in the sense that it's really making this effort of streamlining what exists. Obviously, it is not doing the end goal would really be to have a more streamlined path and some frameworks that are globally accepted, as I was presenting at the very beginning of my research. And this, the FAN is obviously not doing this. It's not selecting any of the frameworks. It's not making any decision, and it's not giving any, it's not really deciding inside of the companies. So it is still a repository of what exists, and not a decision on what should exist and should not exist. So I would say, I think it's really welcomed by our stakeholders and by companies. But it is only the first step, as Scott was also mentioning during his presentation. Ideally, this document at some point will not exist anymore, because it won't be needed, because the whole reconciliation work would have been done, and the global community will have agreed on something. So I would say something like that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lucy. Right, we have 3 minutes left. So very quickly, Christina, I'm going to come to you for a question, and then I'm going to close. So again, it's a very similar question. Through your work at South Pole, you work with companies every day on all aspects of water stewardship. How are you sensing this kind of conversation externally about essentially the interoperability of all of these things? Are you hearing this demand for clarity and alignment from your clients, essentially, as you go about your work?
Yes, I think this is what we already see with especially CSRD now, it being the first year and having the question on double materiality. But we've also seen it already with TCFD, where water was one of the areas that was shown as being a driver of climate change related risks. And I think what we're seeing is a recognition for companies that they need to increase their understanding. And very quickly, when companies start to understand something, to gather information, to gather data, they want to take action. And they also want to understand, what can you expect of me here? Where should I be taking action? Where should I be collaborating? There's a question, for example, when it comes to action, how do we scale collective action? Who should be driving it? How can a company collaborate? And I think it really depends also on where we see a company is at. If the first interaction on looking at water in your value chain and the operational sites is due to CSRD, there is a lot of catching up to do, since when it comes to question around your water consumption, water withdrawal, and so on, you do actually want a year of data or so to understand that. So I think the quick answer is yes, we're seeing a need for further clarification to help companies take more action, and that's what we want to see.
Thank you, Christina. And with that, I'm going to bring this session to a close. So thank you ever so much to the wonderful panelists. We are very clearly hearing this drive for more work and harmonisation on standards. And if you want to find out more, please do reach out, especially to Leslie at BSI. And I believe her contact details are on the session description. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.